Hey guys, today we're going to talk about characterization. This is the technique that authors use that reveal their character, and it can be quite simple and it can also be quite complex. So, I'm going to walk you through a handy hack that helps me remember the way the authors reveal the character. Also, keep in mind you're going to be filling out notes as you go along. Anything underlined or written in blue means that it needs to be filled in on your guided notes. This will be useful for you as you're working on your independent reading books as well as the exemplar text that we're going to look at together. So, as I mentioned, it can be quite simple and complex as well. So, looking at the first technique, this is called direct characterization. It's pretty standard. This means when the author directly states the traits. For example, if I'm the author of a story and I'm writing about a girl named Quinn, I have a 3-year-old named Quinn, and she has a bit of a temper. So maybe if I'm writing a story about her, say Quinn was angry or Quinn has a temper. That is an example of direct characterization because I directly told you about her. You didn't have to guess or infer or read between the lines or any of those sorts of things. I simply told you that Quinn has a temper. So, not all characters and stories or all people in real life are as simple as Quinn. She's only 3 years old, but I have an 8-year-old daughter as well, and Harper. Many of you know her. Harper is not as obvious what she's feeling. However, sometimes I can figure it out. For example, if I were to look at her and um, her her brow was wrinkled or furrowed, and her face was red, and her arms were crossed, I could put all that information together to conclude, to infer that she is angry. So, unlike my example with Quinn, where it was obvious, I just told you that Quinn was angry or Quinn has a temper. If I were writing a story about Harper, I would give you hints at that. And that's something I want you to notice about the progression of my children. In as much as my 3-year-old is pretty easy to understand, my 8-year-old is harder to understand. And my students, my teenagers, you guys, you're much older, your feelings are more complex. So I have to make inferences about you. And we do the same with characters in a text. The more sophisticated the work is, the more thinking we have to do in order to understand it. Now, I say complex, but honestly, you are very capable. You do this on your own. If I were to tell you that, let me think of a really good example. Let me put pause. If I were to tell you that Josie, this imaginary character in my imaginary story about my imaginary classroom, Josie sat in the corner with her head down, I would need a little bit more information. Yes, there are cars going by. I need to do this outside because inside my kids, Harper and Quinn and Carter, they're a little bit crazy right now. Anyway, so excuse the noise in the background. But Josie, my imaginary character, if I were to simply state that her head was down, I would need a little bit more context about her than that. It could be that she didn't feel good. It could be that she's sad or even depressed. Characters can be very complex and you have to use a lot of information sometimes to figure it out. So this is what we call indirect characterization. Direct, the author plainly states it. Indirect, you have to infer. So, what are we doing and why do we have to do this? This is important to me to address this at the beginning of every new module. But what we're going to be doing is analyzing complex characters. We're not analyzing characters like Quinn. We're going to look at the more deep, complex characters that develop over a course of time. We're going to look at how they interact with other characters and also how the relationships of the characters advance the plot of the story and how does that ultimately build towards theme. So this is part 1 of a series of many lessons on characters and how they play a bigger picture than just people in stories. And why do we do this? Another one of my favorite things about literature is that we can relate to them. Characters are like us. I would hope that I would only have the bravery and the strength and pride and protection of family that Katniss Everdeen has. And I want to be ambitious like Leslie Knope in Parks and Rec. And I'd like to have the wit and intelligence of Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Because characters are just like us, or like we want to be. Sometimes we even see our own flaws in them too. So this relatability of characters helps us understand human condition, and that's why we learn from books. We don't just read to be entertained, although it's quite entertaining to me. I try to emphasize this over and over. I understand that all of us don't love to read, but we can relate to the characters if we look for it. So take a moment and think about which characters in books that you've read, or television or film that you most relate to, or maybe that you'd like to be like. You can pause right now. When you're done, move on to the next. So it's not just by accident that these complex characters are telling these amazing stories through their lives. There's technique that authors use. There's an intentional approach to how they develop their characters. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to give you a hack, which is some sort of like shortcut to memorizing something. And if you can memorize this word and what each letter and the word represents, then you'll be able to analyze characters at a deep level, and it will ultimately help you understand the story even larger, even more. You know what I mean. So this is it right here. The word steal. Steal, as I mentioned, is an acronym that stands for the different parts of indirect characterization. Remember, that's the way we have to infer, read between the lines what the author's revealing to us about the characters. So in your notes, follow along. I'm going to give you each of the words represented in the word steal, and they're all the different techniques that the authors use. So I'll give you examples of each in just a little bit, but first go ahead and fill in the blanks. First, author reveals characterization through what the characters say, what they think about. Now, we don't always get this information, what they think about. There's always dialogue, so we know what they say typically. Um, but we don't always have the thoughts of the characters. I enjoy a narrator that will tell the story from first person point of view, but sometimes a third person narrator will also tell us what the characters are thinking. So if we can get that information, it's very useful. I think about the Hunger Games. If you've seen the movie, it's fantastic. However, the book is written from the point of view of Katniss, and when you listen to her talk about her sister and her mom, her resentment towards her mother, you start to get a bigger picture of her motivation for why she does what she does. Instead of just watching this girl volunteer as tribute, you're like, why would she even do that? But when you get in the thoughts of the character, you really understand motive. And motive is a huge role in the story arc. The next thing I want to look at is the effect the character has on other characters. We want to pay attention to the way they act, and finally, the way they look. Now, the way they look can be written very obviously, like direct characterization, like they look angry, but it could also be indirect, like I mentioned before about the furrowed brow, red face, or tight jaw. All of those can be signals as to being angry. So, looks, and they could be very subtle. It could be a movement. Well, that would be more like action. I think I skipped over action. If I didn't say action, we have to pay attention to the way they act, right? And then looks. So, steal. And I will walk through some examples of each in the following sections of this lesson. Pause here if you need to write this down.